In reading your book, I was struck, sort of thinking ahead to this evening, by what begins the section on Sheffield, or indeed the chapter entitled Communism and Art, Ruskin, Sheffield and the Guild of St. George. And it opens with a little extract from something from the Sheffield Daily Telegraph, written on the 28th of April, 1876. Last evening, about 20 persons assembled at the new museum established by Mr. Ruskin at Walkley for the purpose of hearing Mr. Ruskin's opinions on various subjects and of giving their own. Amongst those present were 6 ladies. The proceedings were chiefly of a conversational nature, and no set speech on any one of the several subjects dealt with was given. Primarily, the subject of communism came up, and its most extreme principles were freely and enthusiastically advocated by 1 or 2 of those persons. Now, we might not get onto communism, although we might, but I think we will be sort of floating through a number of different subjects in our conversation.
In fact, we're going to do a reenactment. Everybody got their hats, boots, and we'll do a reenactment of that evening in Walkley, shall we?
We should do. That's right, because one of the quotations you talked about as well was where Ruskin is talking about the sort of communism side of things, and somebody from the floor says, you know, let's all have boots made, and then Ruskin responds, why not hats?
Yeah,
I think was the response.
Yes, yeah? yes. I mean, the point was that, in fact, a number of the people who were eventually to move over to St. George's Farm, which is just across in Derbyshire, they'd been brought together by the man who was running the recently founded museum, and a number of them seemed to have been cobblers, which is why the idea of making boots and living in furnished apartments, but still, yeah. And Ruskin was delighted to meet them and eventually bought the farm for them. So there we are, sign of Ruskin's generosity.
And for those of you who were here earlier today, you'll have heard more about that side of the story, and in terms of Ruskin setting up Sheffield and the museum here and so on, as part of the earlier talks throughout the day.
Yes, I must congratulate you. 4 sessions on Ruskin for some of you is pretty good, I must say.
But I suppose one of the things I've often wondered about you, Robert, and I've known you for about 20 years now, because we first met when I arrived to do my PhD at Lancaster, and there was a magical term when I first arrived where Robert was running the Ruskin seminars before he then went to Oxford to be the Slade Professor of Art there, a post that Ruskin had in fact inaugurated, or was the first one in the post of. But I'm not sure I've ever heard what drew you to Ruskin in the first place.
Ambition. Yeah. No, actually, it's, the story is that after I left university, Oxford, where I'd been an actor with Michael Palin for Sheffield people, so I used to come to Sheffield in the 60s, and I must say the place has changed. Anyway, after university, I tried to work in television. I did work in television and found it a very horrible experience. But a friend of mine who was a general trainee at the BBC said to me, Robert, I'm looking for a subject for a half-hour drama documentary in a studio based. So have you got any ideas? And I thought a bit, and I was actually very keen on French culture. And I tried to persuade him to recreate a 19th century literary dinner. And he said, no, it's French. And then I suddenly remembered the Ruskin Whistler trial, because as a schoolboy I had read again and again and again The Aesthetic Adventure by William Gaunt. Does anybody remember that book? Wonderful book, first published 1945. Terrific book about the 19th century. Anyway, I loved it. And so I said to my friend, I said, trials make good television. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I explained that this genius painter, this great witty American, Rachel's Canadian, had taken this terrible bearded fuddy-duddy to court for saying that for he, Whistler, to charge 200 guineas for one of his pictures was the equivalent of throwing a pot of paint in the public's face. And I thought, great. And I managed to find a lot of the documents, which are actually in the Library of Congress in Washington for some reason. Anyway, and I managed to do this produce this half-hour drama documentary about the trial, about Whistler and about Ruskin. And the whole premise was that Whistler was, the avant-garde and Ruskin hopeless. After 6 weeks, I realized that Ruskin was the man I wanted to devote the rest of my life to. And indeed, I have done, in a sense, because after the show went out, I decided I had to do something about it. I'd already graduated. And then I was invited to go to Brantwood, Ruskin's house in the Lake District, where there was a conference. This was the first major scholarly conference about Ruskin probably ever. And it was very interesting. There were people from Japan, America, France, and so on. And we all came together in Brantwood. Now, I don't know, again, if you visited Brantwood these days, it's a really great place, great restaurant. Seriously. And it's a very warm and receiving place. Well, I can tell you in Easter 1969, it was freezing cold. And indeed, I remember the frost formed on the inside of the windows. Anyway, but what happened was that I was there amongst these Ruskin scholars, and I realized the only thing for me was to go back to university and study Ruskin. Unfortunately, I met someone there, Rachel Trickett, who was a Don at Oxford, and I said to her, "Can I come and study with you?" And she said yes. And in those days, you didn't have to pay, how much is it now, to a degree?
9,000 a year?
9,000 a year, or whatever it was. And so I went back to Oxford, I wrote a thesis about Ruskin, and then I wrote my first book on Ruskin, and The Argument of the Eye. So my passion for Ruskin began with this strange encounter through television. Michael Gough, do you remember the actor Michael Gough? Michael Gough played Ruskin. He was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. He had to do a nude scene, which was extraordinary because Ruskin goes mad in the middle of all this, throws off all his clothes in the middle of the night and kills a cat. All this we had to do. And Michael Gough rose to that brilliantly. And so I became very interested in Ruskin. But in spite of the fact that I'd then got another degree, a degree doesn't actually exist anymore. It was called a B.Lit, Bachelor of Letters. It's now called an M.Lit because the Americans don't understand what bachelors are. So it's a Master of Letters. Anyway, I was able to finance my way through university as a broadcaster. Because having spent all those years with Michael Palin doing sketches, sending up the BBC, naturally one went to work for the BBC as a broadcaster afterwards. And as a result, I was working in the African service, a place I'd never been to, and I was able to support myself through university and indeed through my first 2 or 3 books by working part-time as a broadcaster and the rest of the time as a non-fiction writer. So I didn't become an academic, and in fact I never have been an academic for quite some time. Rachel.
One of the things that I've often sort of toyed with in terms of Ruskin as an idea, and you've sort of slid us toward it with that mention of Michael Palin, is Ruskin and his sense of humour. Because looking at that image, for example, we see a rather sort of almost glowering face coming over us, but that's not by any means the only Ruskin. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about Ruskin and humour.
Well, of course, this image, which it's not clear, in fact, whether it is a self-portrait or whether it was by a man called Charles Fairfax Murray, who was one of the copyists who worked for him. We still cannot decide. This image, this watercolour, is now in the Tate Gallery, and the Tate Gallery says it's by Ruskin. So if the Tate Gallery says it's by Ruskin, it must be, mustn't it? But still. And of course, this is at a time of great personal stress in the 1870s, after the death of Rose Latouche and so on. But as a young man, he was a very happy chap. And indeed, once you tune in to Ruskin's language, which is difficult, if you read his memoirs, his unfinished memoirs, Praeterita, they're actually full of jokes. They're full of irony. They're full of humour and those things. I mean, he wasn't a comedian. He didn't stand up and tell jokes when he was Slade Professor. But he had a very imaginative way. And of course, the great thing about Ruskin was that he discovered the art of lecturing. This was the most direct form of communication. And it really derives, of course, from the fact that he spent his childhood going to evangelical services and listening to long sermons which he would then make notes on in the on Sunday afternoon. And he was a brilliant lecturer, and he would have all sorts of wonderful devices. They didn't have things like slide projectors and things like that. So if he wanted to demonstrate pollution, for instance, one important theme, he would have one of his own precious Turner watercolours, glazed under glass, and he would say, well, I think it's Derby he's referring to. This is Derby and Turner's day. And then he'd get a paintbrush and gradually paint over as the smog and the smoke. Another time he was talking about engraving. So he had a great hand plough in front of, on the demonstration table and so on. So yes, I do think Ruskin had a sense of humour, though of course his life was eventually tragic. He also drank a lot.
For 2 weeks. And
Sorry?
I've had Fresher's flu for 2 weeks and just getting over it, but still have that lingering drive to want to cough about things.
Poor thing.
I know. Thinking about today, and you were caught in the floods coming up, sort of sliding up this notion of pollution to a degree, but you were caught in a bit of the flooding. Others have been delayed arriving here because of flooding around the region. Reading your book, something that keeps popping up again and again are drains and drainage. And I'm wondering whether you can sort of tell us a bit about Ruskin's interest in drains and drainage and why it's a motif that runs through your book.
It's a subterranean motif, isn't it, as it were. If we're Freudian, we'd say something very sinister about drains and drainage. No, he was obsessed with drains. I think partially he loved water. He loved clear water. But he was very, very concerned about drains for a very practical reason, and that is cholera. Because twice in the 1840s, Oxford was struck by cholera. Now, it so happens that the university colleges are on a different water system to the town, and the town got the cholera. But one of the things Ruskin did was that when he became Slade Professor, he got very fed up with the way that most of the undergraduates spent their time playing cricket and rowing. Neither of these things he thought useful exercise. So he said, I'm going to make my people, my students, the ones I'm teaching, learn what useful work is. And he led them out to a place called Ferry Hinksey, which is on the west side of Oxford, which had been badly hit by cholera. And he built a road. And these people say he built a road, but actually what he was trying to do was to drain the land so that cholera would not prevail. But he had an obsession with the waters of the Alps, because he spent a lot of time in Switzerland and so on, and he would observe the way the water would pour off the mountainsides. Nothing useful was being done with it. And he was very, very concerned, and he had various plans to dam various aspects of the Alps so that the water would be preserved. This wasn't a hydroelectric scheme, Well, of course, none of that happened, but when he bought Brantwood in the Lake District, he actually, in the gardens, you will find the traces of a very elaborate drainage system, and there were big tanks up in the hills above the house. And when he had a visitor, even Charles Darwin came to visit him once, he would send one of his people running up the hill and turn the waterfall on, so that when the people came up the drive, there was this wonderful waterfall. Now, as I say, we can speculate on the Freudian things of this, but again, you see, if you look at he spent a lot of time in Venice. When you realise that until the 1870s, there was no fresh water in Venice apart from the from the water that came up from the wells, which you now see, the Pozzi. And when I was researching my book on Ruskin and Venice, I discovered that the water was brought in these big barrels, and actually people had to go and buy it. You actually had to go and buy your water if you weren't able to get water from one of these wells. So water, and what is water a symbol of?
Life?
Life, yes. That's where it comes from. It's the purity. It's the purity of life, and that purity which he really wants to preserve through all his environmentalism and so on.
You've mentioned the Hinksey Ferry project, and again, thinking about the book, one of the figures who at least claims to have been involved in that, and you talk a bit about the claim in the midst of that, is Oscar Wilde.
Yes.
So I wonder if we should begin to get ourselves onto the notion of Ruskin and his contemporaries and talk about a few of the people who pop up in the book. For example, Oscar Wilde and Ruskin.
Well, yes. I mean, Oscar Wilde, they're a generation apart, but Oscar Wilde came up to Oxford in the middle of the Hinksey Road project, and he wheeled a wheelbarrow. And he writes about this. When Oscar Wilde, who'd come with a very distinguished classical degree from Dublin and so on, Trinity College Dublin, and he was at Oxford, and he did clearly sit at Ruskin's feet as well as wheeling a wheelbarrow for him. Later, when he was then got this wonderful job in America as touring, because the D'Oyly Carte, the man who put on Patience, the famous satirical operetta about the aesthetic movement, D'Oyly Carte, thought it would be a very good idea to send Oscar Wilde to America to talk to the Americans, so that the Americans would get the idea of what an aesthete might look like. And indeed, Oscar Wilde had a special costume made and so on. And when he goes to America, these lectures pay a great deal of respect to Ruskin. In fact, they pay so much respect as that when I sat down to read them, I discovered, hang on, this isn't Oscar Wilde, this is Ruskin. And in fact, he'd plagiarized large chunks of Ruskin's lectures to flesh out his own. And in fact, I am actually working at the moment on a little project to reproduce his lecture, which is called The English Renaissance. I was recently in Los Angeles for a Ruskin event, and this shows actually the interesting how wide Ruskin's influence was, contemporary influence, because I was invited to Los Angeles by the Ruskin Art Club of Los Angeles, which was founded in 1888 and was for ladies only. I'm glad to say they're not for ladies only now, but it just shows the way there is this great interest. Anyway, because of Oscar Wilde in America, I'm planning to do a little book reprinting this lecture with a sort of commentary and so on for David Zwirner books. But that's a project in the future. But yes, I mean, someone was saying to me earlier, often we think of if you spend your life studying one man, you tend to see them completely in isolation. And, of course, if they're the face on the book and so on, you only think of them in isolation. But they are part of a milieu. The Pre-Raphaelites are a group, and it's their group identity which is really important about them. Individually, they're all extremely interesting, but it's that group relation. And then when you discover that Ruskin patronized them in the sense, in the best way, i.e. he bought their work, gave them money, helped Lizzie Siddal, all those kinds of people. When you realize that people like Thackeray, friends, he knew Dickens, he knew Eliot, all these people, so that one of the reasons for doing this book was to put him in a broader context. Although each of the chapters the original title for the book was Ruskin and, just Ruskin and, because all the chapters are Ruskin and this and Ruskin and that. But I realized maybe that wasn't might have been a bit avant-garde, if you ask me. So we decided to call it Ruskin and his contemporaries, though there are other themes. And indeed, one of the great pleasures of this year, this bicentenary year, which we are celebrating, and thank you all for helping us celebrate that, is I've had to do so many talks on Ruskin and other people, I might have to do another book called Ruskin and More of His Contemporaries.
You've mentioned people like Elizabeth Siddal that he supported in terms of her wanting to be an artist. You've mentioned the ladies only Ruskin Art Club. One of the other figures that comes up in the book, not necessarily as an artist, but as an important female figure of the period, is Octavia Hill.
Yes.
And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about Ruskin and Octavia Hill.
Well, usually when people talk about Ruskin and ladies, they talk about the ones that he was in love with, like Rose Latouche. But in this case, Octavia Hill was in love with Ruskin. Now, Octavia Hill, a brilliant social reformer from a very distinguished and radical family, Octavia Hill actually came to Ruskin through the London Working Men's College. Although Ruskin was a Tory, he believed very much in adult education, working class education. And it was through the group around the London Working Men's College, who were mainly Christian socialists, like F.D. Morris and so on, and James Furnival. And she was associated with them and did some secretarial work for them. So she met Ruskin, who must have been about 15 years older than her, something about that. And she had a drawing talent, and Ruskin gave her drawing lessons and indeed commissioned copies from her. And I discovered there are one or two little woodcuts in the 5th volume of Modern Painters, which you can actually attribute to Octavia Hill. But Octavia Hill's real passion, of course, was for housing reform. And the way she got started was that after Ruskin's father died in 1864, he inherited a vast sum of money. I mean, relatively vast sum of money. Certainly he was probably a millionaire. Never done a day's work in his life. His father had been the sherry merchant, as you will know, and made all the money. And Octavia Hill said, I have this scheme by which I want to create housing for working class people that will be clean, that will be sanitary, and that will not be exploitative. And in fact, it was Ruskin who bought the first houses for Octavia. But again, interestingly, I discovered that although this was a great act of philanthropy, he said, and I want 5%. Because he thought this would keep, as it were, Octavia Hill on the fast, hard and narrow, as it were. And she indeed did as it were, earn the 5% back. And the way it was run is that each of these groups of houses, some she had built, some she bought, there would be a kind of woman volunteer, middle-class woman volunteer, who would collect the rents. But by collecting the rents, of course, she had to have a social engagement with the people in the houses. And so she made sure that they were being properly looked after, that they themselves were, of course, also behaving properly. And there is a place in South London, the Red Cross cottages, which are still there, which show that it wasn't just, putting up, it's not just social housing. There was also teaching, there was a maypole, there were festivals, there were dancing, they were doing all those things. In fact, it was a pioneering, though actually very conservative form of social work. Eventually, Ruskin gave Octavia the houses. She, meanwhile, was nursing this passion for him. And they fell out. They fell out because one thing, although Ruskin was a visionary, like many visionaries, he wasn't very practical. And I'm afraid she let slip in the world of charities in London. She's made this slight remark about the fact that, well, he's a great man, but he's not very practical. And this got back to Ruskin, and they had a great row. But the story of Ruskin and Octavia Hill, which hasn't really been told, okay, there are a couple of biographies of Octavia Hill, but this relationship, and that's partially because, of course, we have so many letters between them, and the letters tell this extraordinary story. So, she was just one of the people. I mean, Ruskin was very passionate about women's education. He supported the founding of Somerville College in Oxford, and indeed they have some jewels which he presented them with, and a couple of paintings. And also he supported Girton in Cambridge.
Ruskin and the environment seems to be such a timely thing at the moment, particularly thinking about the uprising of things like Extinction Rebellion and so on. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about Ruskin and the environment, maybe in the context of his contemporaries a little bit. Sort of your thoughts on that?
Well, Ruskin was let's look at it this way. He was a landscape painter. Therefore, he was an observer of nature. Therefore, he was an observer of the skies. And particularly in Brantwood, where I don't know if you know the place, but it's above a lake with this wonderful mountain on the other side called the Old Man, Il Vecchio, as Ruskin used to call it, and fantastic skies. And Ruskin, who as a boy, when he went with his parents on tours to Switzerland, would have a little instrument, this kind of piece of paper with different shades of blue. He got the idea from Humboldt, I discovered recently. And that was called a cynemometer, I think that's right. So you could see what colour the sky was, and he would record the colour of the sky. That was as a boy. So he was always observing nature, and what he observed, of course, was the gradual pollution of nature by industrialization. And this eventually, to him, became an obsession, particularly as his own mental storms and rages grew. And so he identified this thing as what he called the storm cloud of the 19th century. And this was a lecture he gave in London, demonstrating how the clouds have been darkened by industrial pollution. The other thing, of course, that he engaged in very much with the environment was the fact that they were building railways into the Lake District. And he, like Wordsworth, objected to this. Though I must say that once the railway line was built to Coniston, he used it regularly, because I suppose we all do, don't we? In the end, we come in. But for him, rather like pure water, dark clouds, that's the negative. That's the negative to the purity of that. And it was absolutely true that the clouds were darkening, because over the hill there was Barrow, great shipbuilding town, steelworks, all those things. So he wasn't wrong to see the way that pollution was coming. Another form of pollution, ironically, was tourism, not just of the Lake District, but also of Venice. And this again is tragic in a sense, because Ruskin has done more to make people want to go to Venice, I think, than almost any other writer and artist. And yet, he saw Venice being eroded. Recently, the Venetians have suggested putting in toll gates, charging people to go into Venice. And they think this is a new idea. It isn't. Ruskin thought of it first.
Hearing you talk about Ruskin and Venice has sort of reminded me of one of my magical Ruskin moments. And I think a lot of us who get caught up in the world of Ruskin have magical moments that sort of slightly shift our perspectives on Ruskin along the way. And for me, one of those was after a conference in Venice, after dinner, wandering back with Robert on a bit of a Ruskin tour of Venice, because his hotel was very near the university campus that I was staying on, and we were sort of wandering back together. And that was absolutely magical in the nighttime in Venice, having somebody who knows the city so well, knows Ruskin so well, sort of pausing and pointing out various important things along the way, for which I thank you, Robert. And I'm wondering...
Could I say how lucky I have been that it so happened I was once asked to do an exhibition in America on Ruskin and Venice. And I said, well, I'll have to live in Venice. And they said, but of course. So Venice has been my speciality, and I love the place, and yet I feel guilty every time I go there.
In terms of being a person
being
arriving...
a polluter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose I've just outlined one of my magical Ruskin moments. What about yours? What have been moments where you sort of encountered something or someone and your relationship with Ruskin and the ideas of Ruskin shift a bit in light of that?
Well, obviously, Venice is the obvious thing, because, in fact, people think writing about someone who's been dead for 100 years or whatever it is, all you do is sit in a library and read books and all that kind of stuff. There's no substitute for actually going to the place where your subject has been. There's absolutely no substitute. You suddenly understand the physical relationships which impinge on that. My wife and I did a little rail tour of Switzerland once in the footsteps of Ruskin and so on. And when you actually get to Chamonix, and you discover what a horrible place it is these days, and you get up onto the glacier, and you see the way the glacier has disappeared and is disappearing, which goes back to pollution and environmental change and so on. And to spend a night, there's a little wooden hotel at the top of a funicular, and it's quite difficult to get booking. I don't know why, and it's mainly used by walkers, but my wife and I went up there to this wonderful wooden hotel, which I think Ruskin might have known it, but I'm not sure. And the train stops at 6, but the light continues. And there weren't very many of us in the hotel. And we just stood there, and Ruskin's drawings of Chamonix and around there, I suddenly realized, gosh, there's that. And oh yeah, now I know what an aiguille is. All those things. So that actually was one of very, very many special moments. But I mean, just to go to Brantwood, because it's not a pretty house, but the views are magnificent, and I think that's why he chose to end his days there.
I'm aware that our time is quite quickly slipping away, but you've just been talking a bit about Europe and Ruskin in Europe. And I don't think I can let that slip by without asking you, the cultural historian, but a cultural historian who very much in the midst of the books takes the notion of Ruskin, the Tory, and Ruskin, the communist, and rolls them together and explains much of that to us as a sort of lay audience. Ruskin and Europe, Ruskin and Brexit. What do you think?
Well, Ruskin was very odd as a politician. He despised politicians. He never voted. He himself, as he said, was a violent Tory of the old school. He also said he was a communist, reddest of the red, but that was in a different context. Ruskin was deeply concerned with Europe. I mean, European civilization, in France, particularly France and Italy. He never got to Spain. He didn't spend much time in Germany. He did go to Germany because he'd been criticized for not knowing enough about German museums and so on. But from an early age, his parents, the father, who of course was drawing his fortune from Jerez in Spain, so they were Europeans in that sense. And indeed, Ruskin fell in love with one of Domecq's daughters and so on. Ruskin spoke good and read good French and modest Italian, and clearly the civilization, the culture with which he's imbued, particularly Gothic culture, which was a pan-European culture, is absolutely vital to him. And I think I always think it's foolish to say, well, what would he have said now? There's no point, he's dead, and everything's different. But I think he would have seen the absurdity of what appears to be going on. One of the finest passages of, we haven't mentioned what a great writer he was, we haven't really mentioned what a great artist he was, which is, again, what makes him so special amongst the Victorians. One of the great passages in the Stones of Venice is an imaginary flight of a bird from North Africa to Scandinavia. And it is an overview of Europe, in a sense. And clearly, he sees the differences between the cold north and the warm south, and the way that Venice is a kind of combination of these two things. But it is such a wonderful piece of prose. And as I say, it is a view of Europe which shows that he saw himself as a European. I mean, he was, in fact, a Scotsman, technically, I suppose. So presumably he would have stayed in anyway.
We're basically at the time where we thought we would open up the conversation so that it's no longer just the two of us, but opening out to the floor. Sorry?
Do you want to come and have questions? Are you okay?
I think we're okay, are we?
What?
We can field our own questions.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Does anyone have
Are
questions?
there mics to be... Aha, good.
A mic. Right, this is where everybody sits silently. Oh, yeah.
I have a question.
Oh, good.
I know that, obviously Ruskin himself was a visionary, and I believe that in many ways, but I just wondered when we're thinking about his contemporaries, which one or ones of them actually were influential, on him, influential to him, because we always talk about who, Ruskin influenced.
Well, Carlyle was very important. Thomas Carlyle, not a nice man, to say the least. But Thomas Carlyle gave Ruskin the idea of what we call critical medievalism. That sounds a bit academic, but what it meant was that Carlyle saw the Middle Ages as a time, not as a kind of the Dark Ages, with everybody going around eating earth and all that kind of stuff. He saw the Middle Ages as a period of great civilization and so on, and he contrasted that in a book called Past and Present with the present day. And Ruskin I think Ruskin was very much influenced by that idea in particular. Also, the other thing that Carlyle did was he, in order to make a living, when he came to London from Scotland, he gave a series of lectures on great men. And the interesting thing is, the one example of a great man that he does not mention or talk about, and that is an artist. So when Ruskin comes along, he fills that gap with J.M.W. Turner. So in a sense, the hero artist, and that is J.M.W. Turner. So obviously, Carlyle's important influence, but we should also acknowledge the influence of science, because he was, as his father said, my son was a geologist before he was an artist. And so Charles Lyell, William Buckland, some of those the early natural theologians, that whole scientific thing was again very important for Ruskin, because the science they practiced was the science of observation. You could even say Humboldt actually was an influence on him, and so on. So those are I think those are important influences on him. Also, of course, he, like many people, could be slightly naughty about his influences, because it's quite clear that Augustus Welby Pugin, who is the other great Gothic, who is a great Gothic architect, great Gothic revival architect, clearly influenced Ruskin a great deal. But the problem was that Pugin was a Catholic convert, and at this stage, in the early part of his life, Ruskin was a very strong evangelical. So Ruskin actually says, oh, I never really read Pugin. But we know he did because we got his notes on Pugin. So, people, that's actually Harold Bloom, having died recently. That's the kind of anxiety of influence. And of course, the other profound influence, when I think about it, is Wordsworth. Byron, Wordsworth, and the Bible. The Bible. So the English translators of the Bible, profound influence. Hooker and all that. Question there.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to have heard a bit about his relationship with Octavia Hill. I'm trying to research her, but particularly her sister Miranda, and a number of personal relations. So if you could say any more about his relationship, his love life, or anything to do with Miranda, I'd love to hear more on that.
Well, every time one does something like this, there's one question which is going to absolutely floor you. Well done. No, I know about Miranda. Miranda worked, one of the things the Hill sisters did is they ran a school where they made toys. And indeed, Ruskin bought, and other objects. And in fact, Ruskin bought a couple of things. And so he would have known Miranda, certainly. But if you have a look at this book and look in the bibliography, that would give you, that would certainly give you more on Miranda. But thank you for flooring me. He's one.
Any more on his love life then?
His love. Well, the point about Octavia Hill is that she definitely, I think, Gillian Darley, who wrote his biography, thinks I'm pushing it, but I don't, because I've read the stuff. It's quite clear to me that she was in love with him. But he didn't reciprocate. So, nothing there.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
What do you think Ruskin's lasting legacy is going to be, or is? Or what is he best remembered for? Not his love affairs, I'm sure.
Not his...
Love affairs.
No, that's... Though we must confront that, and we must acknowledge that, just as we must have acknowledged his penchant for imperialism. His legacy is quite simply the phrase, there is no wealth but life. by which I mean that he took on the whole conventional economic thinking of most of his contemporaries, certainly the economists and so on, and he argued that no, our systems of values are going seriously wrong. And I'm glad to say Andrew is here as well. I think Andrew would agree. It's the Ruskinian values which have been perpetuated, particularly by the Guild of St. George, of which I'm not a member, so I can say this. I can praise the Guild of St. George because I don't belong to it. I think the sort of values which are now represented by what the Guild of St. George is trying to do here in Sheffield, also in the Wyre Forest and so on, I think that is a permanent legacy. Academically, you could say, well, another of his permanent legacies is the fact that the front of St. Mark's looks like the front of St. Mark's, because he personally, with a Venetian friend, managed to stop it all being restored and turned into an awful grey monument. I think his lesson about seeing clearly, we're back to the water, his belief that you had to observe, you had to look, and you had to render what you saw as truthfully as you could, is to me a kind of value which is worth sustaining. And it's very interesting to me because, as you may know, Ruskin died in 1900. So in 2000, there was a similar kind of celebration of Ruskin then. Very helpful because it gave us a chance to practice, for this, the bicentenary. And what is interesting is that in 2000, people were interested in Ruskin from an aesthetic point of view. They were very interested in his drawings, in his writings about artists and his connections with artists, and that was fine. This time, people really want to know about his ideas, I find. You must do, you've been here all day, some of you. And I think that tells us that, unlike most Victorians, this legacy is live. And I'm very grateful to On the Shelf for letting us, celebrate that legacy during this day. Well, no?
You mentioned scientists and geologists and Lyell. Do we know what Ruskin's response to the origin of species was? And what may it have contributed to his rejection of early religious upbringing?
Yes. In fact, there is a chapter in the book on Ruskin and Darwin. It was one of the ones I wrote new for the book, because some of the other ones have appeared in other places and that kind of thing. And the more I read it, the more I realized that Ruskin could not confront Darwin directly, because the ultimate argument of Darwin is there is no point to life beyond just reproduction. Now, Ruskin, as we all know, had a problem with reproduction anyway, and the idea that the whole world had been reduced simply to the unending battle for resources, which of course is what capitalism is, this so horrified him that I actually think that not so much on the origin of species, but the book which doesn't mention men and monkeys, as everybody goes on about, doesn't mention men and monkeys. It's the succeeding book called The Descent of Man, thank you, yep, called The Descent of Man, where he actually says, basically, life is just about reproduction. Beauty in animals is only to attract a stronger sexual mate, and so on. And Ruskin, although he is actually, your question about being funny, he's quite funny about Darwin, but this funniness is actually because he can't cope. And I actually think that Darwin contributed to Ruskin's eventual insanity, his loss of faith and hope and so on, because it was so destructive of the settled early Victorian worldview of natural theology, in which science and art had no conflict at all because they were both about God's work. So no one's actually had come back at me yet about my theory about Darwin's destructive influence on Ruskin, but I do think it was, very, very serious.
I would have thought Ruskin would have found the progressive element of the origin of the species quite satisfying and comforting. The idea that evolution is moving toward a social and biological perfection.
Well, yes, except that this seems to be perpetual and self-generating. It's not God-descended. And I think it's that which really got through to Ruskin. Plus, again, as I say, the origin of the species is less disturbing than the descent of man. Which you obviously know that because you prompted me on the title. And I can't quote it, but there is some of Ruskin's little jokes about Darwin and the theory, the Darwinian theory, really are quite amusing.
Do we have time for one more, or is that where we?
Yes, please do.
You said that Ruskin was, I'm taking this, a supporter of imperialism. I wondered what that was rooted in. Was he a nationalist, a patriot, or was, and particularly it seems perhaps a contradiction to saying that he was also a European, pan-European, and imperialism became a competition between the European nations. So,
right, yes, well, very good, excellent question. He, in his inaugural lecture as Slade Professor, he's talking to the undergraduates of Oxford, all men, of course, and he sees these young men, and he has a sense of mission, and he says to them towards the end of the lecture, "Go forth, and wherever there are," and this is the key phrase, "waste lands, occupy them, make them great, and we will spread ourselves across." So, which clearly was an invitation to go out and colonize, to make the British Empire, because this is, the date is 1870, this is a time of imperial upsurge and so on. And interestingly enough, Cecil Rhodes, not a nice man, had, although he wasn't at the lecture, he had a handwritten copy of this lecture which he kept with him. So there is, I'm afraid to say, a direct link there. But then, Ruskin was was a man of his time, and naturally there was the thought that of a kind of imperial destiny, and the whole business about if there is waste land, we must make it fruitful. Well, that's exactly what the Guild of St. George was about. That wasn't imperialist at all. That was to do with trying to make the world fruitful, make the land fruitful. And one of the motives for the Stones of Venice is, if you read the first chapter, the first sentence is this superb sentence about three great empires: Tyre and Venice, which destroyed Tyre, and now there is an empire which, if it doesn't watch out, is going to go the same way. And that, of course, was the great naval empire, like Venice, the British Empire.